Part of me wants to say good morning, but it's like it's afternoon, right? I'm going to grab one of these. Ty, thank you. That was amazing. How many of you guys were here last year and heard Ty speak? Don't you just, guys like him drive you crazy? This guy over here, he's so gifted. Last year, I'm preparing for this thinking, man, I hope I'm half as brilliant as Ty was last year. He did such a good job of encouraging us in the Word and teaching us, and then thank you for leading us in worship. It was so good. And I love this conference. Last year was the first time I was able to get here. I've been invited here several times, and last year I finally figured out a way to break loose and get here. And so many of these, I've been doing worship ministry for 30 years, and I've been around different types of things and gone to conferences and lots of them. And most of the ones that I've been to are about the how. And I love this one because it's a good balance of how, but it's a lot about the why. We started out talking about this is about your heart. And that's where we have to start. We have to begin there. And so my underlining premise in everything I do in ministry is that if we will get the why right, the how will take care of itself. And I don't mean we don't have to think about the how, that we don't have to prepare for the how, that we don't have to be good stewards of our craft. I don't mean that. But I mean if we know why we're doing something, that's going to inform how we prepare ourselves. It's going to inform everything that we do. And so I'll just tell you a little bit about who I am and my experiences. It always helps me to know where somebody's coming from. That way I can kind of interpret what they mean sometimes. But I was born in north central Nebraska, Ainsworth, grew up there, was a heathen, was very good at it. And on a dare from my best friend between my junior and senior year of high school, my best friend dared me to ask the Methodist pastor's daughter to go to homecoming. And so having more guts than brains, I said, okay. I asked her, and to my shock and amazement, she said yes. And then she went home and said, I have to ask my parents. And I thought, well, that'll be the end of that. And she came back the next day and said, my parents said I can go with you, but they want to meet you. And I thought, okay, I've gone this far, I'll go. And so I went and I met them, and they, over the next year, their family loved me into the kingdom. It's just a phenomenal story of how the kingdom should work. I sat there in the first weeks of getting to know them, looked the pastor in the eye, and flat out lied to him, and he knew it. And but he continued to love me, continued to draw me in. And we dated for about 4 or 5 years. When we broke up, I actually missed him more than I missed her. And if she was sitting here, I would say that. We're still friends, oddly enough. We still communicate. We send Christmas cards back and forth, talk about our kids, that kind of thing. So, and the really cool thing, man, how much time do we have? I'm going to get these sidebars all over. I had the amazing opportunity a few years ago to be at my class reunion, and her family was there, and I got to bring my boys and say, guys, if it wasn't for this family, I don't know where we'd all be right now. Just an amazing, amazing thing. So I knew immediately that I was called to ministry and that I was a worshiper. I grew up in a musical family. We used to go to my grandparents in Roscoe, right up here, and we would load the van. We had a long van, but that was back before all of the big church vans kind of thing, but this was a big Dodge van, and we'd load amplifiers and guitars and all kinds of stuff in there, and if we had room for clothes and pillows and sleeping bags, we could bring those along. But we would play music all weekend, so I knew exactly where I was going to fit in the kingdom. And a guy named Mike McGinnis, who now pastors a Methodist church in Omaha, really drew me in and ministered to me, and so it was that whole idea of how that came together. But he began to teach me these ideas about worship and things like that, and then I had such an amazing journey. And I want to honor a couple of people. The first one is a guy named Job Vigil. Some of you guys know Job. He's from North Platte. And I remember him doing a conference at our church in Ainsworth at the E-Free Church. And I remember sitting in the congregation and listening to him just share his heart about worship and what it was about and the foundations of it. And I remember sitting in the congregation saying, I'm going to do that one day. And so I'm the luckiest guy I know. I get to work with churches all over the place and help build healthy worship and ministry teams and help people understand that worship ministry is a ministry of helps. And so hopefully we'll unpack that a little bit over the weekend. But Job was one of those guys. And then I ended up at Kearney State College And I was the guy that could play the guitar and sing. Now, that's open to interpretation, I understand, but they thought I could. And so they had me standing in front of the group leading choruses. How many of you guys remember leading choruses? That was before we led worship. And they were actual choruses, right? You know what I'm talking about. And so we were doing this, and I'm learning these songs, and I'm sitting in my dorm room one afternoon. I'm playing my guitar and singing these songs, and I felt the Spirit of God say to me, "Are you doing this for me, or are you doing this for you?" Because it was pretty cool to be standing in front of a group of people as a freshman at Kearney State in front of all these people, and then it draws some attention. And I couldn't answer the question, and I didn't really want to answer the question, if you know what I mean. And I felt conviction come on me, and so I put my guitar back in the case, I slid it under my bed, and I didn't take it out for 5 years. Now, I played privately a little bit, but I didn't lead choruses, none of that. But during that time was an amazing time of learning from people like Andy Park, who I've never met. But Andy Park has mentored me. He's one of the original Vineyard worship pastors. He's written a book called To Know Him More. You need to buy the book. Get on Amazon, and it'll cost you probably $2 in shipping, and you can get the book for $1.50. But it's a phenomenal book. Andy Park mentored me. And then I ended up in this little place called Torrington, Wyoming. And God was starting to give me permission to get back into worship ministry, and I felt like that my heart was in a better place. I wouldn't say that it was right. But this guy came alongside me. It was Derek Jackson. Many of you know Derek. And if it wasn't for Derek, I don't know that I'd be here today. Derek is that guy who said to me, on Thursdays, I plan the worship set, and so why don't you just come around and we'll work through it. And so I would come to his office in the afternoon, and this is the guy that began to share the heart of worship to me. So it was just this amazing time of learning and growing, and Derek would throw me into the fire and thinking I'm not ready, but that's what a good mentor does. He believes in you more than you believe in yourself, and he's amazing at doing that. So thank you, Derek. And then I ended up at Hillsong College. My wife and I and 2 boys, we packed up everything. We've sold everything we owned, packed up a few things, put it in storage in north central Nebraska, and off we went to Sydney. And that was another time of seeing some incredible things happen and just learning the heart of worship. So that's a little bit about my story. But before we go any further, I have just been impressed this last 2 weeks that I just want to start right here. And so you're looking at me going, what's this crazy guy carrying a football around for at a worship conference? In 1961, the Green Bay Packers were at training camp. Now, stay with me if you're not a football person. This ultimately is not about football. 1961, the Green Bay Packers were at training camp. They had just lost the championship game the previous year to the Philadelphia Eagles. They had led that game for 3 quarters, and in the final quarter, they lost the game. And so here is a group of, I want to say about 2-3 dozen professional athletes at training camp getting ready to build on what they knew from the previous year to win the championship that year. And so they expected strategies, they expected all kinds of things. And Vince Lombardi, you've heard this, I'm sure a lot of you, Vince Lombardi famously stood in front of his football team and he said, "Gentlemen, this is a football." And he started going through the playbook from the very beginning, and they started talking about blocking and tackling. And they talked about the fundamentals. What is the basics of playing the game of football? They went on from that year to win the next 5 out of 7 championship games. They never lost a playoff game. And Vince Lombardi today is credited as one of the greatest football coaches of all time. And I think this is where we are as a church. We're in the age of technology, and I love technology. I have an iPhone. As soon as it's a 5S. As soon as my contract runs out, I'm going to go get a 6. I'm an early adopter. I was one of the first ones to have a Palm Pilot. You remember the old green ones with the stylus? Yeah, I had that. It was a mess. I'm not against technology, but I think sometimes we lose focus, we lose sight of the foundational things, the important things in my mind. If we know why, the how will take care of itself. We lived in a small town just outside of Lincoln when my wife and I were first married. And you could stand on one end of the house and look across, and they had taken a wall out. Actually, we took the wall out after we moved in. And you could see the ceiling from the living room to the dining room go like this, and then from the dining room to the kitchen go like this. And one time I went up into the attic to take a look at some things, and there were rafters everywhere. It was just all over the place. And so if you're a carpenter, you'll understand this. If I have a 12-foot 2x4 and I want 12 1-foot pieces of 2x4, now we're just going to assume that the blade is not going to take out any material, right? So if you're really that kind of a detail person, we're going to ignore that bit. And I take out my tape measure, and I measure the first 1-foot piece. Then I put the tape measure back on my hip, and I use the first piece as my standard to measure the second piece. And I make my mark, and I cut. And then I use the third piece as my standard. You see where I'm going with this? Have you ever done this before? I have. This is why this works for me. I can tell you by about the 5th piece, you're all over the place. You're going to have 12 pieces that are nowhere near 1 foot, because the standard continues to change over time. And what we tend to do is correct to the previous mistake instead of correcting to the standard. I have the incredible privilege of working with churches, and one of the things that I teach worship teams is if you're not in the Word, you're not in intimacy with God. John 1:1 says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. If you want to know Him, you've got to seek Him where He is to be found, where He has revealed Himself. Right here. This is the standard that we adjust to, that we correct to, always to hear. This is me arguing with myself right here. If you see me. And God always wins. Well, not always. Hopefully more often than not. I think if we're going to begin at the beginning, we have to start with... We tend to make the assumption that when we come into a place like this, that everybody... I just don't want to assume that everyone in here has taken that step to make Jesus Christ the Lord of their life. I don't want to assume that someone has loved you enough to tell you the gospel story and to tell you that there's a Savior that died for you and wants nothing more than for you to be in relationship with Him for the rest of your life, for eternity. If we're going to begin at the beginning, that's the beginning. It's not inconceivable in a room this size that somebody is in worship ministry because they're gifted. Hopefully we're all there because we're gifted on some level. Well, I'm not the most talented guy in the room, so I've never had to deal with that. But I don't want to assume. So I want to make an invitation today. We're not going to raise hands. We're not going to have an altar call, but I just want to give you the opportunity. If you've never taken that time and said, God, I realize that I've fallen short. I realize that I can't earn a place in the kingdom by my good behavior, by my talent, by my skill, by any of that, that I come to you by faith and I apply your blood sacrifice to my sin so that I can be saved and be with you for all eternity. I don't want to make that assumption. But I also want to think about a lot of us, we get into this speed of ministry, I call it, and it goes quickly. And we tend to lose sight a little bit. And so I love the idea of this is about your heart. And that lyric in the last song that we did, perfect submission, all is at rest. Let's go there this weekend. So I just, not a big deal, no music, no emotion. I just want you to ask yourself the question, where am I? Have I ever taken that step and invited the presence of God into my life in a way that saves me, that changes me? If you've never done that, I want to pray for you. If you're here and you're completely blown out, burned up, used up, let's just take a minute and start there and just invite the presence of God to come. And Ty did such a good job of creating that space for us today. I want to stay in that place here for a little bit. So let me pray for you. Father, I'm just so grateful for what you've done, not only for me, God, but for all of us, that you made a way, that you left the throne room of heaven to come and dwell among imperfect, sinful people so that we could come boldly into your presence. And so, Father, I pray for that individual or individuals that might be here today, Lord, that have never taken that step. And God, I pray that you would speak to their hearts and draw them to yourself. And Lord, for those that are here that are maybe burned out a little bit or tired or not sure even if they want to continue in ministry, and maybe they're here this weekend to be refreshed and recharged, God, I pray that you'd meet them right where they are. Father, that your word would pierce our hearts and that we would go from here changed, and we would never be the same again. So, Lord, we thank you for your presence. Thank you for your love for us. We commit our hearts and our hands and our minds to you today and this whole weekend. It's in Jesus' name and in faith in what you've done for us that we come. Amen. Amen. So thank you for allowing me to do that. Recently, I ran across an article by a guy named Matthew Sigler. He's from Asbury Theological Seminary. This is a Methodist. And so I found it very interesting that this perspective came from a Methodist. We tend to have this, I do, I'm sure y'all are different than me, but I tend to think that, different denominations are maybe at a different place as it relates to worship. So I confess that to you straight up. So I come across this article from a Methodist who had this perspective, and I was spun out. But he absolutely nails it. And it's a long article. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But this is what he says. He says, looking at what happened when praise and worship was adopted by mainline denominations. During the 1990s, many mainline congregations began to impart the songs, sounds, and some of the sights, like hand raising and clapping of the other praise and worship style. And in many cases, what got lost was the robust pneumatology behind this approach to worship. In other words, many mainline churches brought the form, but did not bring the theology of praise and worship into their congregations. And this is a gross generalization, he admits, but I think it explains some of the dislocation that occurred during the worship wars of the 90s. The result was that the songs themselves and the style itself became the focus, particularly in mainline congregations influenced by the church growth movement. Contemporary worship was a technique for reaching out. The concept of praise and worship as sacramental and an encounter was diluted at best. I find that very, very interesting what he says, and he names the Assemblies of God and the Vineyard movement specifically in his article. And what he says is mainline denominations, us Methodists, took the style of it, we took the form of it, and we thought that's where the magic was. And we brought that into our context, and we put these great bands that were doing all the right things, but for some reason, here we are all these years later, and there's no life in our worship. And he's answering the question, why? And I believe this is why a lot of the worship wars are happening today. And I wonder if when we have these conversations about should we do hymns or choruses, I find it interesting we're still calling the songs that we do choruses from a guy who started doing actual choruses 25 years ago. I don't think it's really about hymns or choruses. I really don't. And we've had these conversations. I have these conversations all the time. And I wrote an article not long ago on my blog called Smoke, Lights, Worship, ? And my point was, lights and smoke do not make what we do on Sunday a show, and the absence of lights and smoke do not make what we do on Sunday worship. So the question was asked this morning is, how do we get people to worship? And I think what it's about is, it's hopefully you'll catch this vision over the course of the weekend, but it's about loving God's people. And it's about preparing a place. And that's what we're going to talk about here today to start this all off. And I think sometimes we've lost the value of God's people in the process. We talked about it a little bit this morning, is this idea of the speed of ministry. And there's this expectation that it's bigger, louder, prettier, all of those kinds of things. And again, I'm not against any of those things. I love all of those things. I think we ought to incorporate every bit of it. I've spent 2 years at Hillsong and 10 years at New Life, and it's a production every weekend. It is this massive show. But worship happens. And worship happens there because the people that are overseeing that are people of the secret place. I say Darlene check today, and most of you go, Darlene was a worship pastor of Hillsong Church while I was there, and she would change the atmosphere in a room when she walked in, not because she's a rock star, but because she's a woman of the secret place. She lives there. She carries the presence of God. And when she stands on the platform, we have lights, we have smoke, we have all this stuff. But what she's doing is she's looking into people's faces. She's in relationship with people throughout the week. And worship happens for that reason. And the lights and the smoke and all the other things are not distractions, because at the heart of it all is the presence of God. And so how do we do that? I think it starts with this idea of loving God's people, and that's where I want to get to. And I think it's amazing that the theme of the weekend is pulse, because I feel like the theme of the messages this weekend are Acts 20:28. We're going to talk about Acts 20. We'll do that tonight. Today we're going to be in John chapter 3, but Acts chapter 20 is where Paul says, "Take heed to yourselves and to the flock, God's flock, of which he bought with his own blood and has made you overseers." I feel like that's kind of the theme verse for us this weekend. And so make no mistake, if you've been chosen to steward the worship ministry in your church, you are an elder. That's a function of an elder. Someone who's mature in the faith and who is leading a particular thing. And God has put you in that place. Romans chapter 13 says that he has chosen you for that specific time and for this specific purpose, to be an elder, to oversee God's flock, and to remember that he bought them with his own blood. So that's foundational to everything we're going to talk about this weekend. Your primary responsibility is to shepherd those who have been entrusted to you. And if we start there, boy, I bet I could say your primary responsibility is like 7 or 8 things, and be right on all of those. But for the weekend, and I think they set the tone right off the beginning. This is about our hearts. It's about the team that God has entrusted to us, and ultimately about those that God has entrusted to us in the seats. It's about serving them. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm already starting to preach tonight's message. So I think we have to do that here's 4 things. First, we have to have a supernatural love for the bride, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. What does it mean to love the bride? And then also, we have to know how to prepare a place for the bride and the bridegroom to come together. We're going to do that on Saturday morning. And then recognizing when the bridegroom enters and getting out of the way. The number 1 rule of leading worship is get out of the way. Now, we have to have a certain level of ability and skill to do that. But number 1 rule of leading worship. You ask my kids from the cottage school, you ask the churches that I go to, hopefully they'll say to you the number 1 rule of leading worship is get out of the way. How do we do that? How do we know when to do that? How do we recognize when the bridegroom enters? And so let's go to John chapter 3. We're going to unpack this. I hate the clock. You've all heard this story. This is John the Baptist baptizing by the river. And let's start in 3. Where do I want to start? Yeah, let's start in 25. Then there arose a dispute between some of John's disciples and the Jews about purification. And they came to John and they said to him, "Rabbi, he who was with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you have testified, behold, he is baptizing, and all are coming to him." And then John answered and said, "A man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from heaven. You yourselves bear witness to me that I said I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is fulfilled. He must increase, but I must decrease." It's such a great passage of Scripture. There's so much in there. But I want to start with this idea of that so the disciples of John the Baptist come to him, and they're all up in arms. You know that guy you baptized the other day? He's down the river, and everybody's going to him. And so he says to them, "I have told you that I'm not the bridegroom. I've told you that. I'm the friend of the bridegroom." What's the friend of the bridegroom? The best translation we have in modern times would be the best man. The difference is the bridegroom in a traditional Jewish wedding was called the Shoshben. And that's a huge role. So I want to really explain that this weekend. Am I doing something wrong? Do I need to do something different? No? Just keep on trucking? All right. So the Shoshben was the best friend of the bridegroom, and he is the one who took care of everything. And so Ellicott's commentary defines the Shoshben this way. He says, the friend of the bridegroom was charged with the preliminaries of the marriage. He arranged the contract, acted for the bridegroom during the betrothal, and arranged for and presided at the festivities of the wedding day itself. It was a position of honor in proportion to the position of the bridegroom himself. Now that'll spin you out a little bit. And was given to his chief friend, and that friend then joyed in his joy, and there was none brighter on that day than him. Now, the traditional Jewish wedding had three parts to it. The first part is the betrothal. So you've heard about the betrothal because that's what Mary and Joseph, that was the time frame when Joseph found out that Mary was with child. And that's when he made the decision to continue because the angel came to him, right? So the betrothal was this intense period of negotiation between the two fathers. And the Shoshben was the person that was the negotiator. Now, as we're talking about this, I want you to think about this in the context of leading worship and how these things might apply, because I think this is a beautiful example of our job and our calling and our role as worship leaders. So during the time of betrothal, the Shoshben's job was to facilitate and negotiate that contract. There was a wedding contract, there was a dowry, there was all kinds of things that were going on during that time, and the Shoshben oversaw that. And then there was the time of separation, and that's when the groom would go off and build a room on his father's house in preparation for the marriage. Now think of that, when Jesus said, "In my house are many rooms." I'm going there to prepare one for you, actually, and I'm going to be back soon, and there's going to be this wedding. Think about that in terms of what we do as worship leaders. And so the Shoshben's job was to prepare the guest list, to prepare the meal, to invite people, to prepare the room, to have everything set up the way it was supposed to be, all of that. And then there was the wedding processional, the ceremony, and the feast. And the Shoshben provided over all of that. He was the master of ceremonies. And it says that he had a job that was similar in honor as the bridegroom. So again, we could unpack that for quite a while, and I don't want to take that too far as an analogy. But we need to take seriously our role on Sundays and beyond that. What does it look like? So the Shoshben also presided over what was called the wedding chamber. And so when the ceremony ended, he would take the bride and escort her to the wedding chamber. And that's where he set up the place where they would come together. And what would happen in there is they would let's see. Yeah, they would bless one another, they would exchange gifts, and then they would break their fast in there. And that's where the marriage was consummated. And so what he would do, he would bring the bride to that wedding chamber, let her inside, and would stand outside the door. And so when John the Baptist says, "When I hear the voice of the bridegroom, my joy is complete," right? So here's this picture of the bridegroom, or the bride, right? The bride is out here, and we're guarding the door. We're standing there. And we hear the voice of the bridegroom, then what happens? We open the door, we let him in, and we get out of the way. I think that's a phenomenal picture of what a worship leader's job actually is. And so we're going to talk about that this weekend. What does it mean to love the bride? How do we prepare a place for the bride and the bridegroom to come together? And then how do we recognize when the bridegroom enters? That's a tough one. I don't even know how to teach that, but we're going to try on Saturday night. So let's unpack this just a little bit. So the Shoshben was charged with the preliminaries of the message, and so that would include choosing the order of the service. How many of you're charged with the whole service, not just choosing songs, but the whole thing? Yeah, everything, right? The whole order. So do you have the freedom to mix that order up somewhat? Yeah. And so have you ever thought about, this is just the way we've always done it, or is there another way that we could prepare a place without causing a complete rebellion? Yeah. So it's thinking through all of those things, choosing the order of the service, the songs, rehearsal time, and pastoring your team. That's a huge part of what we do, is connecting with those people and loving them. We looked in Isaiah 40 this morning and talks about, what does a shepherd do? Shepherd loves the sheep. Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, looking after them. But it all requires relationship. It requires knowing them. It requires spending time with them. And then acting on behalf of the bridegroom, so arranging the contract. And this one was interesting to me because I'm thinking, we're not arranging really a contract. The contract has already been arranged, right? And so it's our job to help people understand the contract and to teach it. Somebody said this morning in one of the sessions, this idea of wish I could teach worship. And we don't have access to the pulpit sometimes. And so where do we have to do that? We have to start with teaching our team what this contract is about and what's in it. What is yours? What isn't yours? What has been delegated to us? What things are important to God? What things should be important to me? What values do we emphasize when we come together? The idea that practice is personal and rehearsals are relational. Now that's an idea that sounds really great, but try to implement that. And so we've got to be able to teach people that they need to practice at home, that they need to build their skill and their craft at home, and then spend time when we come together, worshiping together and praying for one another. That's when everything changed. That's when this idea of the team coming together really was brought home to me. And then arranging it for and presiding over the festivities. So everything that pertains to the day of the event. Preparing the wedding chamber, the sights, the sounds, the smells. Everything is going to impact that. And are we thinking through all of those things? And I don't want to add more to your plate of things that you need to do, but I just want to introduce this idea. And then it says that the Shoshben joyed in the bridegroom's joy. And he said, our joy is complete when the bridegroom enters. And so what if he doesn't enter? Have you ever had that situation? What do I need to do? It's out here. Yeah, I can do that if that's what it takes. So how about a hand for these guys back here? That's another thing that it's very easy that I would work it out next time, but thank you. It's very easy to get in the speed of ministry and forget about why we're doing what we're doing. It's about God's people. It's about leading our team. It's about leading the people that are in the congregation every Sunday. And I'm probably the worst offender at this, is that I forget about the guys back here. And so when we come together, they're trying to get all the pieces and bits together, but we need to include those people that are back there doing the job, and they only get noticed when something goes wrong, right? And so when I didn't give them the right slides, and the wrong thing comes up, does everybody go, man, that worship leader's a knucklehead? No, they all look around to the guys back there. Yeah. So the job of the Shoshben was given to the bridegroom's best friend. Are you the best friend of the bridegroom, is my question. Are you spending time building, cultivating, growing that relationship? Would you be considered the best friend of the bridegroom? Would you be the one that has been invited to preside over all of those things? And the job is a position of honor. Do I view this position as a position of honor? Do I look at this as something that's an honor? I look at this as something that's a job. And I don't say that to be condemning. I know none of us, we all came to this idea of leading worship from a sense of calling, from a sense of loving the presence of God and loving God's people and wanting to be involved in that. And over time, we can build things on without correcting to the standard. We can add things to it, and we can get caught up in all of the other bits, and we forget about the primary thing that we're called to do is to love God's people. And it starts with our team, and it goes to loving those that are in the congregation, so being a part of that. So over the course of this weekend, we're going to talk about all of those things. What does it mean to love the bride is where we're going to start tonight, and then tomorrow's all about unity. And then we're going to talk about how do we recognize the bridegroom entering. But so I just want us to take some time as the worship team comes back, and I want you to think about what if we led worship from that standpoint? Because the really amazing thing is not only are we the Shoshben, that we're presiding over it, but we're also the bride. We have been taught, I've been taught and brought up and trained my entire life to be a servant. And so sometimes we approach these things as with the heart of a servant, which is not a bad thing, but to add the identity of being the bride. And so not only trying to recognize the bridegroom coming from the position of guarding the door and protecting and all those kinds of things, but from a larger perspective that I'm going to commune with the bridegroom as well. And so Leading worship is just about one thing, and that's leading God's people into God's presence. And so what's the metric for understanding if that has been accomplished every Sunday? Is, did the presence of God come? But sometimes it doesn't come. Kind of jumped over this earlier. And so when the presence does not come, we just guard the door until he does come. Because I think sometimes he will hold his presence. He holds back so that we'll pursue him, so that we'll press in. So we don't get the idea that we can manipulate his presence by great songs, by great production, by all of those things. And so just guard the door till he comes. And just meditate on that this afternoon as we're getting ready to go into this idea of loving the bride. What does that look like? So give it back to these guys. Let's worship together.